People in ancient times worked. They worked every day. The work was necessary for survival. The work was repetitive. The same tasks were performed over and over. Each day brought the same activities. The work continued throughout life. This is how people spent their time. This is what filled their days. This narration describes these jobs. It describes the tasks that made up the jobs. The descriptions are simple. The pace is slow. The work itself was slow. The work required patience and endurance. The work was not exciting. It was simply work. It needed to be done. People did it. Grinding grain. Grinding grain was daily work. Grain needed to be ground into flour. Flour was used to make bread. Bread was the main food. Therefore, grain was ground every day. This was women's work in most cultures. Women ground grain. They ground it by hand. They used simple tools. The work took hours. The grain was placed between two stones. The bottom stone was flat and stationary. The top stone was curved and moved. The woman would push the top stone forward and pull it back, forward and back, forward and back. The motion was repeated. The grain was crushed between the stones. It became smaller. It became powder. It became flour. The movement was tiring. The arms pushed. The back bent. The motion continued. A small amount of grain took time to grind. A family needed much flour. Therefore, the grinding continued for hours. The woman might sing while grinding. She might talk to others grinding nearby. Or she might work in silence. The motion continued regardless. The flour accumulated. It fell from between the stones. It collected in a bowl or basket. When enough had been ground, the grinding stopped. The flour was set aside. It would be used for baking. Tomorrow, more grain would need grinding. The work would repeat. It repeated every day. This was the pattern. The grinding stones were heavy. Moving them required strength. The constant pushing required endurance. A woman's hands developed calluses. Her arms grew strong. Her back ached. This was normal. This was what grinding grain did to the body. Everyone who ground grain experienced this. Young girls learned to grind grain by watching their mothers. They started helping at a young age. Their small hands pushed the smaller grinding stones. They practiced. They developed strength. By womanhood, they could grind grain efficiently. The skill was essential. Every woman needed it. Some households had slaves or servants to grind grain. These women did the grinding for the household. They ground larger quantities. They spent more hours at the task. Their entire day might be consumed by grinding. They ground grain for the family that owned them. This was their primary work. The sound of grinding was a common sound. In the morning, many women ground grain. The scraping of stone on stone filled the air. The rhythmic sound was familiar. It was the sound of food being prepared. It was the sound of daily life proceeding normally. The sound meant work was happening. Survival was being maintained. The grain itself came from fields. It had been grown, harvested, and stored. Now it was being processed. The grinding was one step in a long sequence. Planting, growing, harvesting, threshing, winnowing, storing, grinding, baking, eating. Each step required work. Grinding was the step that happened daily. It was the step closest to consumption. Different grains required different amounts of work to grind. Wheat was easier, barley was harder. The harder the grain, the longer the grinding took. The longer the grinding took, the more tired the woman became. But the work had to be done regardless. The grain needed to become flour. The flour needed to become bread. The family needed to eat. The flour was not perfectly smooth. Small pieces of grain remained. Small particles of stone mixed in from the grinding stones. The flour was coarse by modern standards, but it was what was available. Bread made from this flour was dense and grainy. People ate it anyway. It was their staple food. They ate it every day. After grinding, the stones needed to be cleaned. Residual flour was brushed away. The stones were kept as clean as possible. Dirty stones affected the flour's quality. The cleaning was part of the work. It added to the time required. But it was necessary. The tools needed maintenance. Grinding grain filled hours every day. It was repetitive. It was tiring. It was essential. Without grinding, there was no flour. Without flour, there was no bread. Without bread, there was hunger. Therefore, grinding happened. Every day, in every household, women ground grain. The work was constant. The work was unchanging. The work simply continued. Carrying water. Water needed to be brought to where it would be used. Water was heavy. Carrying water was hard work. This work fell to specific people. Often it was women's work. Sometimes it was children's work. Sometimes it was the work of servants or slaves. Whoever did it, the work was the same. Water needed to be carried. The water source might be a well. The well was in the center of the village or town. People came to the well with containers. They lowered a bucket into the well. The bucket filled with water. They pulled the bucket back up. The pulling required strength. The full bucket was heavy. The rope had to be held firmly. The bucket had to be raised steadily. This took effort. When the bucket reached the top, water was poured into the carrier's container. The container might be a clay jar. It might be a leather bag. It might be a wooden bucket. The container was designed to be carried. It had handles or a strap. Once filled, it was very heavy. Water is heavy. A full container of water required strength to lift. The carrier placed the container on their head. This was common in many cultures. The head could support weight. The neck and spine distributed the load. Arms were free to balance. Walking with a container on the head required practice. Children learned by carrying small containers. They developed balance and strength. Adults carried large containers. They walked steadily, keeping the water from spilling. The distance from the well to the home varied. Some homes were close. Some were far. The carrier walked this distance many times per day. Each trip brought water. Each trip required the same effort. The path became very familiar. Every stone, every rise, every turn was known. The carrier walked without thinking about the route. At home, the water was poured into storage vessels. Large jars stood in the home. They held the water supply. The carrier poured carefully. Spilling was wasteful. Water was precious. Every drop was needed. The storage jars were filled. Then the carrier returned to the well. Another trip. Another container. More water. A household needed much water. Water for drinking. Water for cooking. water for washing, water for animals. The amount varied by household size and activities, but it was always substantial. Many trips to the well were required. The trips happened throughout the day. Morning trips, midday trips, evening trips. Water was needed constantly. During hot weather, more water was needed. People drank more. Plants needed watering. Evaporation reduced the stored water. More trips were necessary. The carrier made extra journeys. The work increased. The heat made carrying harder. The carrier sweated. The water they carried was partly replaced by the water they lost. But the carrying continued. In cold weather, water carrying was unpleasant. The container was cold to touch. The water was cold. The carrier's wet hands became numb. The path might be icy. Walking carefully was necessary. Falling would spill the water and might cause injury. Extra caution slowed the trips. But the water was still needed. The trips continued regardless of weather. If the well was far, the work took more time. Some communities had wells at a distance. The trip might take significant time. Each journey consumed a portion of the day. Multiple trips meant much of the day was spent walking to and from the well. This was simply how it was. The water was where it was. The home was where it was. The distance between them defined the work. Children sometimes helped carry water. They used smaller containers. They made more trips to carry the same amount. Their contribution was significant. It freed adults for other work. Children learned the routes. They learned to balance containers. They learned the importance of water. The work was their education. The work was there. Old people sometimes had difficulty carrying water. Their strength had diminished. They carried smaller amounts, or they relied on younger family members. But if alone, they managed as best they could. The need for water did not decrease with age. The ability to fetch it did. This created hardship. But it was common hardship. Many elderly people faced it. Water carriers knew each other. They met at the well. They talked while waiting their turn. They shared news. They helped each other if someone struggled with a heavy container. The well was a social place. The work of carrying water included this social aspect. Conversation happened during the work. The work facilitated community connection. The containers eventually wore out. Clay jars cracked. Leather bags leaked. Wooden buckets split. New containers were acquired or made. The work of carrying water required maintaining the tools. The containers were important. Without them, water could not be carried. They were cared for accordingly. This work happened every day. Water was used every day. The containers were filled every day. The trips to the well happened every day. The pattern never changed. Water was carried. It was poured into storage. It was used. The storage became empty. More water was carried. The cycle repeated endlessly. This was water carrying. This was essential daily work. Spinning thread. Thread was needed for weaving. Weaving produced cloth. Cloth was needed for clothing and other purposes. Therefore, thread needed to be produced. Spinning thread was how this happened. Spinning was women's work. Women spun thread constantly. The work never ended. There was always more thread needed. The raw material was wool or flax, depending on the region and culture. Wool came from sheep. Flax came from plants. Both needed processing before spinning. Wool needed to be cleaned and combed. Flax needed to be retted and broken and combed. These were separate tasks. After they were done, the material was ready for spinning. The spinner sat with a bundle of prepared fibre. She pulled a small amount of fibre from the bundle. She attached it to a spindle. The spindle was a weighted stick. The weight was called a whirl. The whirl made the spindle spin smoothly. The spindle hung from the forming thread. It spun. The spinning twisted the fibres together. Twisted fibres became thread. The spinner's fingers pulled fibres from the bundle, not too many at once, not too few, the right amount for even thread. Her other hand controlled the spindle. She kept it spinning. The twist travelled up into the fibres. The fibres became thread. The thread grew longer. The spindle dropped lower as more thread formed. When the spindle reached the ground, spinning paused. The thread was wound around the spindle shaft. This cleared space for more thread. Then spinning resumed. The same motions repeated. Pull fibres, twist them, wind the thread. Pull, twist, wind, pull, twist, wind. The rhythm was constant. The work was meditative. The hands knew what to do. The speed of spinning varied by the spinner's skill. Experienced spinners worked quickly. Their hands moved efficiently. The thread formed rapidly. Inexperienced spinners worked slowly. They concentrated on each step. They produced thread, but at a slower rate. Speed came with practice. Years of practice. A skilled spinner could spin while doing other things. She could walk while spinning. She could talk while spinning. She could watch children while spinning. The work did not require full attention once the skill was developed. This allowed spinning to fill time that might otherwise be unproductive. Waiting time became spinning time. The thread had to be even. Thick spots weakened cloth. Thin spots created holes. The spinner monitored the thread. She adjusted how much fibre she pulled. She maintained consistency. This required attention and skill. Even thread required experienced hands. Different fibres produced different threads. Wool thread was warm and elastic. Linen thread from flax was cool and strong. The spinner knew the properties of what she worked with. She adjusted her technique accordingly. Wool was spun differently than flax. The motions were similar, but the details differed. The amount of twist affected the thread's character. More twist made harder thread. Less twist made softer thread. The amount of twist was controlled by how fast the spindle spun and how quickly fibre was added. The spinner chose the appropriate twist for the intended use. Thread for different purposes needed different characteristics. Spinning produced thread slowly. A single thread grew gradually. Much thread was needed for weaving. Therefore, spinning took many hours. Days of spinning might be needed to produce enough thread for one piece of cloth. The spinner worked steadily. The accumulation of thread was gradual. The work could not be rushed. Young girls learned to spin by watching and helping. They started with simple tasks: preparing fibre, winding completed thread. Eventually they tried spinning. Their first attempts produced uneven thread. This thread was used for less important purposes. With practice, their thread improved. By adulthood, they could spin well. The skill was essential for women. Spinning was often done in company. Women gathered to spin together. They talked while they worked. They sang. They told stories. The social aspect made the work more pleasant. The hands were busy, but the mind and voice were free. Spinning time was talking time. Relationships were maintained while thread was produced. The spindle and whirl were simple tools. They were easily made or obtained. Every woman had them. They were portable. Spinning could happen anywhere. At home, in the courtyard, in the fields, at the marketplace. If a woman had a few moments, she could spin. The tools were always available. The fibre was always needed. Finished thread was wound into balls or onto reels. This kept it organised. It prevented tangling. The wound thread was stored until needed for weaving. The storage was simple. Thread did not require special conditions. It waited until the weaver was ready for it. This work happened constantly. Every day women spun thread. The thread they produced yesterday was being woven today. The thread they produced today would be woven tomorrow. The cycle continued. Spinning never stopped. There was always more thread needed, always more fibre to spin. The work was endless and essential. Weaving cloth thread became cloth through weaving. Weaving was skilled work. It required a loom. The loom held threads in tension. The weaver passed other threads through them. The interlacing created fabric. The work was systematic. It was repetitive. It produced the cloth needed for clothing, blankets, and many other uses. The loom was set up first. This was called warping. The warp threads ran lengthwise on the loom. They were attached to the loom frame. They were pulled tight. The tension was important. The threads needed to be parallel and evenly spaced. Setting up the loom took time. It was careful work. But once done, weaving could proceed. The weft thread was passed through the warp threads. Over one warp thread, under the next, over, under, over, under. The pattern was simple. The repetition was constant. The weaver passed the weft through. Then the weft was pushed tight against the previous row. A tool called a beater pushed the threads together. The fabric was dense and strong. After each pass of the weft, the warp threads changed position. Those that were up went down. Those that were down came up. This was done by lifting different sets of threads. The mechanism varied by loom type, but the principle was the same. The threads alternated. This allowed the weft to pass through in the opposite pattern, over threads that were previously under threads that were previously over. The weaver's hands moved rhythmically. Pass the weft. Beat it tight. Change the warp. Pass the weft. Beat it tight. Change the warp. The sequence repeated. Each repetition added a tiny amount of fabric. The fabric grew slowly, row by row. The weaver sat at the loom for hours. The motion continued. The fabric accumulated. The weaver needed to maintain concentration. A mistake in the pattern created a flaw. The flaw would be visible in the finished cloth. The fabric might be weaker at that point. Careful attention prevented mistakes. But the work was long. Maintaining attention for hours was tiring. The weaver rested periodically, then resumed. The work continued until the day ended or the cloth was finished. Different patterns could be woven. Simple over-under created plain cloth. More complex patterns required different sequences. Some warp threads lifted, while others didn't. The weft passed through in complex ways. Patterns emerged in the fabric. These patterns required planning and skill. The weaver had to remember the sequence. The pattern had to be maintained throughout the cloth. The width of the fabric was determined by the loom. The loom held a certain number of warp threads. That determined how wide the cloth would be. Narrow looms produced narrow cloth. Wide looms produced wide cloth. The weaver worked with whatever loom was available. The fabric width was what it was. The length of the fabric was limited by the loom's capacity. Eventually, the woven fabric filled the loom. No more could be added. The fabric was cut from the loom. The finished cloth was set aside. The loom was warped again. New warp threads were installed. The process began again. More cloth would be woven. Weaving consumed the thread that spinners produced. A piece of cloth required much thread. Both warp and weft threads were needed in quantity. The weaver used what the spinners provided. If thread was scarce, weaving slowed or stopped. If thread was abundant, weaving proceeded steadily. The two activities were linked. The finished cloth was inspected. Flaws were noted. Perfect cloth was rare. Small irregularities were common. They were accepted. The cloth served its purpose despite small imperfections. Cloth did not need to be perfect. It needed to be functional. Hand-woven cloth was functional. Some weavers wove for their own households. They produced cloth for their family's use. Other weavers wove for trade. They produced cloth to sell or exchange. The work was the same. The destination of the cloth differed. But the weaving itself was identical. The loom, the threads, the motions, all the same. In some cultures, weaving was women's work. In others, men wove. Sometimes both men and women wove, but for different purposes. Men might weave heavy cloth. Women might weave fine cloth. The division varied. But everywhere, someone wove. Cloth was necessary. Weaving produced it. The weaver's body adapted to the work. Sitting at the loom for hours affected posture. Arms developed strength from throwing the shuttle and beating the weft. Eyes strained from close work. The body moulded itself to the demands of weaving. This was visible in older weavers. Their bodies showed their work. Weaving was quiet work. The sounds were gentle. The shuttle passing through. The beater pressing the weft. The shifting of warp threads. These sounds were soft. They created a peaceful atmosphere. The weaver might sing or hum. The rhythm of the work encouraged rhythm in sound. This work produced the fabric that became clothing. It produced blankets for warmth. It produced bags for storage. It produced cloth for many purposes. The weaving happened daily. Weavers sat at their looms and passed thread through thread. The cloth grew. The work continued. This was weaving. This was how cloth came into existence. Tending fields. Fields required constant attention. Crops did not grow by themselves. People worked in fields every day during growing season. The work varied by the crop and the season, but the presence of workers was constant. Fields were tended. This tending was essential for harvest. Planting happened at specific times. Seeds were placed in prepared soil. The planting might be done by hand. Small holes were made. Seeds were dropped in. The holes were covered. This was done for each seed. Row after row, field after field. The planting took days. Many people worked together. The work proceeded steadily, or planting might be done by scattering seeds. The planter walked through the field. Seeds were thrown outward in handfuls. The seeds fell where they fell. This was faster than individual planting, but it was less precise. Some seeds were wasted, but the time saved was valuable. The method chosen depended on the crop and the culture. After planting, the waiting began. The seeds germinated underground. They sent up shoots. The shoots became visible. The field turned green. This transformation took time. During this time, the field still required attention. Birds might eat seeds, animals might trample seedlings, weeds might grow. The farmer watched and intervened as needed. Weeding was constant work. Weeds competed with crops for soil, water, and light. Weeds reduced harvest. Therefore, weeds needed removal. People walked through fields pulling weeds. They bent down. They grasped the weed. They pulled it from the soil. They moved to the next weed. They repeated this process. The work was backbreaking. Bending constantly strained the back. The sun beat down. The heat was oppressive. But the work continued. Row after row was cleared of weeds. The weeds were piled and removed from the field, or they were left to dry and become mulch. Either way, they were no longer growing among the crops. Weeding happened multiple times during the growing season. Weeds grew quickly. One weeding was never sufficient. The field was weeded. A week later, more weeds appeared. The field was weeded again. This cycle repeated. Throughout the growing season, weeding happened regularly. The work was never truly finished until harvest. Some crops required additional care. They needed watering. Water was brought from sources and poured on plants. This was labor-intensive. Carrying water was hard work. Pouring it carefully to not damage plants required attention. Watering might happen daily during dry periods. The work consumed hours and energy. Some crops needed support. Stakes were placed. Plants were tied to stakes. This kept them upright. It prevented them from falling and rotting on the ground. Each plant was tied individually. The tying had to be secure but not so tight that it damaged the plant. This work required care and time. Pests threatened crops. Insects ate leaves and stems. Birds ate seeds and fruits. Larger animals trampled or consumed plants. People tried to protect crops from these threats. They might pick insects off plants by hand. They might place scarecrows. They might build fences. The protection methods varied, but all required work. Throughout the growing season, people walked through fields. They inspected plants. They looked for problems. Disease, pests, poor growth. When problems were found, action was taken. Diseased plants might be removed. Pest-infested areas might be treated. Poor growth might prompt additional care. The inspection was ongoing. The response was constant. The fieldwork happened every day. Early morning, people went to fields. They worked through the morning. They rested during the hottest part of the day. They resumed work in the afternoon. They worked until evening. This pattern repeated throughout the growing season. The fields demanded attention. The attention was provided. Field workers developed strong bodies. The constant bending, lifting, carrying and walking built muscle and endurance. Their skin darkened from sun exposure. Their hands became calloused. Their bodies showed their work. This was normal. Everyone who worked fields looked this way. During harvest, field work intensified. The crops were ready. They needed to be gathered quickly. Overripe crops deteriorated. Weather could damage ready crops. Therefore, harvest happened as fast as possible. Everyone worked. The fields were cleared. The harvest was gathered. This was the culmination of the season's work. After harvest, fields needed preparation for the next season. Stubble was cleared. Soil was turned. This work prepared the field to receive next year's seeds. The preparation was important. Well-prepared fields produced better crops. So the work happened carefully and thoroughly. This field work sustained communities. The crops grown in fields became food. The food sustained life. Therefore, the field work was fundamental. It was hard work. It was constant work. It was necessary work. People did it because they had to. Because without it, there was no food. The fields were tended. The crops grew. Life continued. Making pottery. Pottery was made by hand. Clay was shaped into vessels. The vessels were used for storage, cooking, and many other purposes. Making pottery required skill. The work was repetitive. The same shapes were made over and over. Each vessel went through the same process. The clay was prepared first. Clay came from the earth. It was dug from clay deposits. The raw clay contained impurities, stones, plant material, dirt. These needed removal. The clay was mixed with water. It was worked by hand. The working broke up clumps. It made the clay smooth. The clay was kneaded. This process was like kneading bread. The clay was folded and pressed. Folded and pressed. The motion was repeated many times. The kneading removed air bubbles. Air bubbles would cause cracking when the pot was fired. Therefore, thorough kneading was important. The work took time. The clay had to be right. When the clay was ready, shaping began. Some potters used a wheel. The wheel was a flat disc that spun. The potter sat beside it. A lump of clay was placed on the spinning wheel. The potter's hands touched the clay. The wheel spun. The clay rose and fell under the potter's hands. The hands shaped the clay. A vessel emerged. The motion required skill. Too much pressure collapsed the clay. Too little pressure left it unformed. The right pressure created the desired shape. The potter's hands knew the right pressure. They had learned through years of practice. The hands moved automatically. The vessel took form. Other potters built vessels by hand. They rolled clay into coils. Long snake-like coils of clay. The coils were stacked in a circular pattern. Each coil sat on top of the previous one. The coils were pressed together. The seams were smoothed. Gradually, a vessel emerged. The method was slow but reliable. Or vessels were built from slabs. Clay was rolled flat. The flat clay was cut into shapes. The shapes were pressed together to form a vessel. The seams were sealed with thin clay. The vessel was smoothed. This method worked for certain shapes. Box-like vessels were easier to build this way. Regardless of the method, the result was a shaped clay vessel. The vessel was still wet. It was fragile. It needed to dry. The vessel was set aside in shade. Direct sun would dry it too fast. Fast drying caused cracking. Slow drying in shade was better. The vessel sat for days. The water evaporated gradually. The clay hardened. When dry, the vessel was still fragile. It was brittle. It could break easily. But it was ready for firing. Firing hardened the clay permanently. The firing happened in a kiln or in an open fire. The heat transformed the clay. It became ceramic. It became strong and durable. The firing required heat. Much heat. A fire was built and maintained. The temperature rose. The vessels were placed in or near the fire. They were surrounded by heat. The heat needed to be even. Uneven heat caused cracking. The fire was carefully managed. The vessels stayed in the heat for hours. After firing, the vessels cooled. They could not be rushed. Cooling too fast caused cracking. The vessels sat in the cooling kiln or ashes. Gradually, the temperature decreased. Eventually, the vessels were cool enough to handle. They were removed. They were now finished pottery. The finished pottery was inspected. Some vessels had cracked during drying or firing. These were flawed. They might still be used, but they were less valuable. Perfect vessels were rare. Most pottery had some small flaw. This was accepted. Pottery did not need to be perfect. It needed to be functional. Some pottery was decorated. Designs were painted on before firing, or patterns were pressed into wet clay. Decoration added time to the process, but it made the pottery more attractive. Some potters specialized in decorated pottery. Others made plain, functional pieces. The potter made many vessels, one after another. Bowl, jar, plate, cup. The same shapes repeated. Each one went through the same process. Prepare clay, shape vessel, dry vessel, fire vessel. The sequence was constant. The work was repetitive. But each vessel was needed. Each vessel had use. Potters worked daily. Their hands were always in clay. Clay dried the skin. Potters' hands were rough and dry. Clay got under fingernails. It stained skin. The potter's appearance showed their work. Everyone knew a potter by looking at their hands. The pottery produced was used everywhere, in every household, for every purpose that required a container. Pottery held water, grain, oil, and countless other things. Pottery was cooked in. Pottery was eaten from. Pottery was fundamental to daily life. Therefore, potters were always working. There was always more pottery needed. Fetching firewood fire was essential. Fire cooked food. Fire provided warmth. Fire gave light. Fire required fuel. Wood was the common fuel. Wood needed to be gathered. This gathering happened constantly. Firewood was collected daily or every few days. The work was necessary and ongoing. The collector went to where wood could be found. This might be a forest. It might be a grove of trees. It might be scattered trees on hillsides. The location varied by geography, but wherever wood grew, collectors went there. They walked to these places. The walking took time. Dead wood was preferred. Dead wood was drier. Dry wood burned better. Dead branches on living trees were broken off. Fallen branches on the ground were picked up. Dead standing trees might be cut down. The collector looked for dead wood. This was the easiest wood to gather and use. Small branches could be broken by hand. The collector grasped the branch. They bent it until it snapped. The broken branch was added to the growing pile. More branches were broken. The pile grew. When enough had been gathered, the carrying began. Larger branches required cutting. A saw or axe was used. The saw moved back and forth. The teeth cut through wood. The motion was repetitive. Back and forth, back and forth. Eventually the wood separated. The cut piece was added to the pile. More cutting followed. The work continued. The wood was bundled. Smaller pieces were tied together. Rope or vine bound them. The bundle was easier to carry than loose wood. The bundling took time. Each piece needed to be arranged. The binding needed to be tight. But the effort was worthwhile. Bundles were manageable. The collector carried the wood home. The bundle was heavy. It was carried on the back or on the head. The carrying was hard work. The distance might be long. The collector walked slowly under the weight. Rest stops were necessary. The journey home took time and energy. At home, the wood was stored. A dry place was needed. Wet wood did not burn well. The wood was stacked. Stacking kept it organized. It kept it dry. The stacked wood was the household's fuel supply. It would be used in coming days. When the supply ran low, more wood would be gathered. The frequency of gathering depended on the household's needs. A large family used more wood. Cold weather required more fire. More fire required more wood. Therefore, gathering happened more often. A small household in warm weather used less wood. Gathering happened less often. But it still happened regularly. Children often helped gather wood. They collected smaller pieces. They carried lighter loads. Their contribution was significant. It reduced the adult's burden. It also taught children the work. They learned where to find wood. They learned how to assess quality. They learned how to carry efficiently. The gathering also cleared the forest floor. Dead wood was removed. This reduced fire risk in the forest. It also made walking easier. The regular gathering maintained the forest in a certain state. The human need for firewood shaped the forest's character. Different woods had different burning qualities. Some woods burned hot. Some burned long. Some produced much smoke. Some produced little smoke. Experienced gatherers knew these qualities. They selected wood accordingly. For cooking, certain woods were preferred. For heating, other woods were better. Green wood, living wood, was sometimes cut. This happened when dead wood was scarce. Green wood needed to dry before use. It was cut and stacked. It sat for weeks or months. The water evaporated. The wood became usable. But this required planning ahead. The wood needed to be cut long before it was needed. The cutting of green wood required permission. The wood came from living trees. Trees were valuable. They provided wood, but they also had other values. Cutting living trees was regulated. Community rules governed it. Individual ownership might apply. The cutter needed rights to the trees. Unauthorized cutting caused conflict. Firewood gathering was year-round work. Even in summer, wood was gathered. The summer gathering prepared for winter. Winter would require much wood. Gathering ahead ensured adequate supply. The summer work prevented winter hardship. Planning and steady effort maintained the fuel supply. This work kept households warm and fed. The gathered wood burned in hearths. The fire cooked the food. The fire warmed the family. The fire made life possible. Therefore, gathering wood was fundamental work. It was hard work. It was constant work. But it was necessary. The gathering happened. The wood was brought home. The fire burned. Life continued. Cleaning and sweeping spaces needed to be clean. Dirt accumulated. Dust settled. Food scraps fell. Animal droppings appeared, if animals lived near or in dwellings. Cleanliness required daily work. Sweeping was part of this work. Cleaning was part of this work. The work happened every day in every household. The sweeping tool was simple, a bundle of twigs or grasses tied to a handle. The bundle was the broom. The broom was pushed across the floor. The dirt was moved by the broom. The sweeping motion was repeated, back and forth. The dirt was pushed into a pile. The pile was removed. Floors were various materials: packed earth, stone, wood planks. Each material accumulated dirt. Each material was swept. The technique varied slightly by floor type, but all floors were swept. The motion was similar. The broom moved. The dirt moved with it. The sweeping happened daily. Each morning the floor was swept. During the day, more dirt appeared. The floor might be swept again. In the evening, a final sweep cleared the day's accumulation. The pattern repeated. Sweeping was constant. The floor was never permanently clean. It became dirty again. Therefore, it was swept again. Sweeping corners required care. Dirt collected in corners. The broom needed to reach into the corner. The angle was awkward, but the dirt needed removal. The sweeper worked the broom carefully. The corner dirt joined the main pile. Every area was addressed. The entire floor was swept clean. The accumulated dirt was disposed of. It was swept out the door, or it was collected in a container and carried out. The disposal method varied, but the dirt left the dwelling. It could not stay inside. The removal completed the sweeping. Sweeping raised dust. The dust floated in the air. It settled on surfaces. Therefore, sweeping was sometimes followed by wiping. Surfaces were wiped with damp cloths. The cloth caught the dust. The surface became clean. The cloth became dirty. The cloth was rinsed. The wiping continued. Tables needed wiping. Shelves needed wiping. Any horizontal surface collected dust. The wiper moved methodically. One surface, then the next. Each surface received attention. The cloth made repeated passes. The dust was removed. The surface was clean. Until dust settled again. Washing surfaces required water. Water was brought for this purpose. The water was used sparingly. It was precious. A damp cloth was sufficient. Soaking wet was unnecessary. The dampness caught dust. The surface was wiped. The dust transferred to the cloth. The method was effective. Floors were sometimes washed. Water was poured. A brush or cloth was used. The floor was scrubbed. The dirty water was pushed out the door or collected. Clean water might be used for rinsing, or the floor was left to dry. Washing floors was harder work than sweeping. It happened less frequently, but it happened. Cooking areas required special attention. Food spills attracted insects and rodents. Cooking areas needed to be very clean. They were swept after each meal preparation. Spills were wiped immediately. The cooking fire area was kept clear of debris. This prevented fires and maintained hygiene. Sleeping areas were also kept clean. Bedding was shaken out. Dust and insects were dislodged. The floor under beds was swept. The cleaning kept the sleeping space healthy. Clean sleeping areas meant better rest and fewer pest problems. Outdoor areas near the dwelling were also swept. Thresholds were swept. Courtyards were swept. The area immediately around the home was maintained. This extended the clean space. It also created a boundary. Inside the swept area was controlled space. Outside was uncleaned nature. The sweeping and cleaning never ended. Each day brought new dirt. Each day required new cleaning. The work was cyclical. It was repetitive. It was necessary. Without it, living spaces became unpleasant and unhealthy. Therefore, the work happened. Brooms moved, cloths wiped, spaces were cleaned. The work continued daily. Children learned to sweep as soon as they could hold a broom. Sweeping was simple work. Children could contribute. Their sweeping might not be thorough. Adults corrected and helped. But the children learned. By the time they were grown, sweeping was automatic. They knew how to clean. They had been doing it their entire lives. This work maintained living spaces. It created comfort. It prevented disease. It showed care for the home. The sweeping and cleaning were acts of maintenance. They preserved the dwelling. They made life more pleasant. The work was unglamorous. It was often invisible. But it was essential. It happened every day in every home. Preparing food. Food needed preparation before eating. Raw ingredients became meals through work. This work happened daily, multiple times daily. The work was women's work in most cultures. Women prepared food. They did this every day. The work was necessary and constant. Vegetables needed washing. Dirt clung to them. The vegetables were rinsed in water. Hands rubbed them. The dirt loosened. It was washed away. Clean vegetables were set aside. The next vegetable was washed. The process repeated. All vegetables were washed before use. Vegetables needed cutting. A knife was used. The vegetable was held. The knife cut through it. Pieces fell away. The cutting continued until the vegetable was fully cut. The pieces were uniform in size when possible. Uniform pieces cooked evenly. The cutting required attention. Fingers needed to stay away from the knife edge. Some vegetables needed peeling. Outer layers were removed. These layers were tough or dirty. The peeling was done with a knife. The blade scraped along the vegetable's surface. Thin layers came away. The peeling fell aside. The cleaned vegetable remained. The peeling was discarded or fed to animals. Legumes needed soaking. Beans, lentils, peas. They were hard when dry. Soaking softened them. They were placed in water. They sat for hours. The water penetrated the legumes. They swelled. They became softer. Then they could be cooked. The soaking happened the day before cooking. It was part of planning meals. Grains needed cooking. They were placed in pots with water. The pot was placed over fire. The water heated. It boiled. The grains absorbed the water. They softened. They became edible. The cooking took time. The pot needed monitoring. Water might need adding. The grain might stick to the pot. Stirring prevented sticking. Meat needed preparation when available. Meat was less common than vegetables and grains. But when present, it needed work. Meat was cut into pieces. The pieces were sized for cooking. Fat might be trimmed. Bones might be removed, or bones might be left in. The preparation depended on how the meat would be cooked. Cooking happened over fire. A pot was placed over flames, or food was placed directly in the fire. The heat cooked the food. The cooking needed attention. Food could burn. Food could remain undercooked. The cook monitored the fire and the food. Experience taught the right timing. Stirring prevented sticking. A spoon or stick was used. The contents of the pot were moved. The bottom was scraped. The food mixed. The motion was repeated regularly. Constant stirring was sometimes needed. Other times, occasional stirring was sufficient. The cook knew which was needed. Seasoning happened during or after cooking. Salt was added. Herbs were added. These ingredients enhanced flavor. The amounts were judged by experience. Recipes were not written. Knowledge was passed by teaching and observation. The cook tasted. The cook adjusted. The seasoning became right. Serving happened when cooking finished. The food was transferred from cooking pots to serving vessels. Or people ate directly from the cooking pot. The method varied by household and culture. But somehow, the cooked food reached the people who would eat it. Cleaning up followed eating. Pots needed washing. They were scrubbed with water and sand or ash. The scrubbing removed stuck food. The pots were rinsed. They were set aside to dry. The cleaning restored the pots to usable condition. They would be needed for the next meal. Leftover food was stored if present. The food was placed in containers. The containers protected it from insects and animals. The food was kept in cool places when possible. It would be eaten at the next meal. Food waste was avoided. All food was used. Preparing food happened multiple times daily. Breakfast required preparation. The midday meal required preparation. The evening meal required preparation. Each meal went through the same process. Ingredients were gathered. They were washed, cut, and prepared. They were cooked. They were served. The vessels were cleaned. The pattern repeated. The work took hours each day. Much of a woman's day was spent on food preparation. The work could not be avoided. People needed to eat. Eating required prepared food. Therefore, the preparation happened. Day after day, meal after meal. The work continued throughout life. Young girls helped with food preparation. They learned by doing. Simple tasks were assigned first. Washing vegetables, stirring pots. The tasks grew more complex as skill developed. By adulthood, a woman could prepare full meals. She had been learning her entire childhood. This work sustained life. The prepared food nourished bodies. Nourished bodies could work. Work sustained the community. Therefore, food preparation was fundamental. It was daily work. It was essential work. It was mostly invisible work. But without it, nothing else was possible. The food was prepared. The people ate. Life continued. Washing clothes. Clothes became dirty. Dirt, sweat, spills. The accumulated soil needed removal. Washing clothes was how this happened. The washing was hard work. It happened regularly. The work was physically demanding and time-consuming. Clothes were taken to water. A stream, river, or washing area. Washing required abundant water. The water source determined where washing happened. The washer went to the water. The dirty clothes were carried there. The clothes were submerged in water. They soaked. The soaking loosened dirt. The clothes sat in water for some time. The water penetrated the fabric. The dirt began to release. The soaking was the first step. After soaking, the washing began. The clothes were beaten. They were laid on a rock. A stick or paddle was used. The stick beat the wet clothes. The beating dislodged dirt. The motion was repeated many times. Every part of the garment was beaten. The beating was vigorous. It required strength. Or the clothes were rubbed. Hands grasped the wet fabric. The fabric was rubbed against itself. The friction removed dirt. Or the fabric was rubbed against a rock. The rough surface caught dirt. The rubbing continued until the garment seemed clean. The work was tiring. Arms and hands grew sore. Soap might be used if available. Soap was not always available. It was valuable. When present, it was applied to clothes. The soap was rubbed into the fabric. It created lather. The lather combined with the dirt. Rinsing removed the soapy dirt. The soap made cleaning easier. But washing happened with or without soap. The rinsing was important. Soapy or dirty water needed removal. The clothes were submerged in clean water. They were agitated. The dirty water flowed out. The clean water flowed in. The rinsing might happen several times. Each rinsing removed more dirt. Eventually, the water ran clear. The clothes were clean. Wringing removed excess water. The wet clothes were heavy. The water needed to be pressed out. The washer twisted the fabric. Water poured from the twisted cloth. The twisting required strong hands. The fabric was wrung as dry as possible. This made the clothes lighter. It also made drying faster. The clean clothes were carried home. They were still damp, but no longer dripping. The carrying was easier than carrying dry clothes would have been to the water. But it was still work. The damp clothes were heavy. The walk home required effort. Drying happened in sun and air. The clothes were spread out. They might be laid on bushes. They might be hung on lines or over fences. They might be spread on grass. The method varied, but the result was the same. The clothes were exposed to air and sun. They dried gradually. The drying took time. Hours in good weather, longer in humid conditions. The clothes needed to be fully dry before being brought inside. Damp clothes mildewed. Mildew ruined clothes. Therefore, the drying was complete. The washer checked periodically. When dry, the clothes were collected. The dried clothes were stiff. The beating and drying had stiffened them. Wearing softened them again. Or they might be folded and stored until needed. The clean clothes were ready for use. They would be worn. They would become dirty. They would be washed again. The washing happened regularly. Once a week, once every 2 weeks, once a month. The frequency depended on how many clothes people owned and how dirty the clothes became. Fewer clothes meant more frequent washing. More clothes allowed longer intervals. But the washing always happened eventually. Washing day was hard work. It consumed the day. The washer was tired afterward. Hands were red and sore from the work. Arms ached from beating and wringing. But the clothes were clean. The household had clean clothing. This was important. Clean clothes were healthier and more comfortable. Children's clothes were washed more often. Children got dirtier. They played in dirt. They spilled food. Their clothes needed more frequent washing. The extra washing was more work. But children needed clean clothes. Therefore, the work was done. Wealthy households had servants who washed clothes. The servants did this work for the household. They washed the family's clothes and their own clothes. The work was the same. The washer's status was different. But the washing itself was identical. Water, soaking, beating, rinsing, drying. The process did not change. This washing maintained hygiene. It prevented disease. It kept people presentable. The work was essential. It was hard work. It was repetitive work. But it was necessary. Clothes needed washing. The washing happened. Life continued with clean clothes. Repairing things. Things broke. They wore out. They needed fixing. Repair work happened constantly. Nothing lasted forever. Maintenance and repair kept things functional. This work happened in every household. It was ongoing and necessary. Clothes developed tears. Fabric wore thin and split. The tears needed mending. Thread and needle were used. The torn edges were brought together. The needle passed through. The thread pulled tight. The stitches held the tear closed. More stitches secured it. The mending was careful work. Small holes needed patches. A piece of fabric was cut. The patch was larger than the hole. The patch was placed over the hole. It was sewn to the garment. The sewing went around the patch edges. The patch covered the hole. The garment was wearable again. The patch showed. This was accepted. Patched clothes were normal. Shoes wore out. Soles developed holes. Straps broke. Repairs extended the shoe's life. New soles might be attached. Leather patches covered holes. Straps were restitched or replaced. The repairs were done by the wearer or by a cobbler. The work required leather working skills, but it was simpler than making new shoes. Tools broke, handles split, blades dulled, repairs restored function. A broken handle was replaced. A new piece of wood was shaped. It was attached to the tool head. The attachment was secure. The tool was usable again. A dull blade was sharpened. A stone was used. The blade was rubbed against the stone. The edge became sharp again. Pottery broke. A dropped pot shattered. The pieces might be discarded, or they might be used for other purposes. Broken pottery became scrapers, or it was crushed and added to new clay. Nothing was wasted. Even broken things had use. Baskets wore out. Weaving came loose. The basket sagged. Repairs involved reweaving sections. New material was woven in. The loose parts were tightened. The basket was reinforced. The repair was visible, but functional. The basket continued to serve. Roofing required constant repair. Thatch roofs leaked when they degraded. The degraded sections needed replacement. New thatch was prepared. Old thatch was removed. New thatch was laid. The roof was watertight again, until the next degradation. Roofs required ongoing maintenance. Fences needed repair. Posts rotted. Crosspieces broke. Gaps appeared. Animals might escape through gaps. Repairs closed gaps. Broken pieces were replaced. The fence was restored. The enclosure was secure. The repair prevented losses. Walls needed maintenance. Mud brick walls eroded. Plaster cracked and fell. Repairs involved replastering. New mud was applied. It filled cracks. It covered damaged areas. The wall was smooth again. The repair protected the wall structure. It prevented further damage. The repair work used materials at hand. Broken things provided materials for repairs. Worn-out things were cannibalized. Parts from one broken item fixed another item. Nothing was thrown away while it had any use. The repairs were creative. They used what was available. Some repairs were temporary. They were meant to last only until better repairs could be done. A quick patch, a simple tie. The temporary fix allowed continued use. Later, a proper repair would happen. But for now, the thing functioned. That was sufficient. Other repairs were permanent. They were done well. They lasted. The repaired items served for years. Good repairs were valued. They demonstrated skill. They showed respect for possessions. Well-repaired things were a point of pride. People learned repair skills by necessity. Things broke. Repairs were needed. Calling a specialist was expensive or impossible. Therefore, people learned to repair things themselves. The knowledge was practical. It was essential. Everyone learned basic repairs. Children watched repairs being done. They helped when possible. They held things. They fetched tools. They learned by observing and assisting. By adulthood, they could do simple repairs. More complex repairs came with experience. The knowledge passed from generation to generation. This repair work extended the life of possessions. It delayed the need for replacements. Replacements were expensive or difficult to obtain. Repairs were cheaper and easier. Therefore, repair was always the first choice. Things were repaired repeatedly. They were used until they absolutely could not be repaired anymore. The work was patient work. It could not be rushed. Careful repairs worked better. Rushed repairs failed. The repairer worked methodically. Each step was done properly. The result was a working item. The work took time, but the time was worth it. The repaired thing served again. Carrying burdens. Things needed to be moved from one place to another. Food, water, tools, materials. The moving required carrying. The carrying was physical work. It happened constantly. Everything that moved was carried by someone. People carried things on their heads. The load was balanced on top of the head. The neck and spine supported the weight. This left hands free. It allowed good posture. Heavy loads could be carried this way. The carrier walked steadily. Balance was essential. Tipping meant dropping the load. Or people carried things on their backs. A pack or basket rested against the back. Straps went over the shoulders. The weight pulled down. The carrier leaned slightly forward. This balanced the load. The walking was slower than usual. The weight affected movement, but the load was transported. Or people carried things in their arms. This was less efficient. The arms tired quickly. But for short distances or lighter loads, it worked. The carrier held the item against their chest. They walked carefully. The burden shifted with movement. Constant adjustment maintained the grip. Carrying poles distributed weight. A pole was placed across the shoulders. Items hung from each end of the pole. The weight on each side balanced. The pole pressed on the shoulders. The pressure was uncomfortable. But much weight could be carried this way. 2 people could share a pole. The load hung between them. They walked in step. Coordination was necessary. Wheeled carts existed in some places. The cart was pushed or pulled. The load rode on the cart. This was easier than carrying. But carts required smooth surfaces. They required maintenance. Not everywhere had carts, and even where carts existed, much carrying still happened. Animals carried loads where available: donkeys, oxen, camels, horses. The animal's strength exceeded human strength. Much weight could be loaded on an animal. The animal was led. The handler walked alongside. The animal did the carrying. But animals required care and feeding. They were not universally available. Most carrying was human carrying. People carried what needed carrying. The carrying was part of daily work. Going to market meant carrying goods there and carrying purchases back. Getting water meant carrying filled containers. Moving harvests meant carrying crops. The carrying was constant. The carrying developed strong bodies. Carriers had powerful legs. Their backs were strong. Their necks were sturdy. The body adapted to the demands. Regular carrying built the strength needed for carrying. The work perpetuated itself. Strong carriers could carry more. Carrying made them stronger. Distance affected the difficulty. A short carry was manageable. The same load over a long distance was exhausting. Rest stops were necessary. The carrier set down the load. They rested. Then they picked it up and continued. The journey might include many rest stops. The total distance was covered gradually. Terrain affected carrying. Flat ground was easier. Hills were harder. Uphill carrying was very difficult. The weight and the slope combined. The carrier struggled upward. Downhill was dangerous. The weight could cause loss of control. Careful footing prevented falls. Level ground was preferred, but terrain was what it was. Weather affected carrying. Heat made carriers sweat. The exertion in heat was exhausting. Carriers tired faster. They needed more water. Cold made hands numb. Gripping loads was harder. Rain made surfaces slippery. Footing was uncertain. The carrying happened in all weather. The work did not stop because conditions were difficult. Multiple trips were sometimes necessary. The total amount was too much for one carry. The carrier made several trips. Each trip carried a portion. Eventually, everything was moved. The multiple trips took time, but they were the only way to move large amounts without help. Cooperative carrying happened when loads were very heavy. 2 or more people carried together. They coordinated their movements. They lifted together. They walked together. They sat down together. The cooperation required communication, but it allowed moving things one person could not move. Children carried lighter loads. They helped with carrying from a young age. Their strength was less, but their contribution was real. They carried what they could. As they grew, they carried more. By adulthood, they carried full loads. The progression was natural. Old people carried less. Their strength had diminished. They carried what they still could. Others helped them. The help was reciprocal. The old person had helped others when younger. Now others helped them. This was how communities functioned. This carrying moved goods through the world. It distributed resources. It brought harvest from fields. It brought water to homes. It brought goods to markets. The carrying made trade and life possible. Without it, everything would stay where it was. Nothing would move. The carrying happened. The loads were transported. Life's necessities were distributed. Tending animals. Animals provided food, labour, and materials. They needed care. The care was daily work. Animals required attention every day without exception. The work fell to specific people. Often children helped. The work was constant. Animals needed feeding. Food was brought to them. Hay, grain, kitchen scraps. The food was placed where animals could reach it. The amount depended on the number and type of animals. Feeding happened twice daily, morning and evening. The animals expected it. They became agitated when feeding was late. Water was provided. Animals needed clean water. The water was brought in containers. It was poured into troughs or bowls. The animals drank. The water became dirty. It was dumped and replaced. Fresh water was provided. This happened daily, more often in hot weather. Animals needed shelter. The shelter was maintained. Bedding was provided. Straw or hay was spread on the ground. Animals lay on it. The bedding became soiled. It needed changing. Dirty bedding was removed. Fresh bedding was spread. This happened regularly, weekly or more often. Most carrying was human carrying. People carried what needed carrying. The carrying was part of daily work. Going to market meant carrying goods there and carrying purchases back. Getting water meant carrying filled containers. Moving harvests meant carrying crops. The carrying was constant. The carrying developed strong bodies. Carriers had powerful legs. Their backs were strong. Their necks were sturdy. The body adapted to the demands. Regular carrying built the strength needed for carrying. The work perpetuated itself. Strong carriers could carry more. Carrying made them stronger. Distance affected the difficulty. A short carry was manageable. The same load over a long distance was exhausting. Rest stops were necessary. The carrier set down the load. They rested. Then they picked it up and continued. The journey might include many rest stops. The total distance was covered gradually. Terrain affected carrying. Flat ground was easier. Hills were harder. Uphill carrying was very difficult. The weight and the slope combined. The carrier struggled upward. Downhill was dangerous. The weight could cause loss of control. Careful footing prevented falls. Level ground was preferred, but terrain was what it was. Weather affected carrying. Heat made carriers sweat. The exertion in heat was exhausting. Carriers tired faster. They needed more water. Cold made hands numb. Gripping loads was harder. Rain made surfaces slippery. Footing was uncertain. The carrying happened in all weather. The work did not stop because conditions were difficult. Multiple trips were sometimes necessary. The total amount was too much for one carry. The carrier made several trips. Each trip carried a portion. Eventually, everything was moved. The multiple trips took time, but they were the only way to move large amounts without help. Cooperative carrying happened when loads were very heavy. 2 or more people carried together. They coordinated their movements. They lifted together. They walked together. They sat down together. The cooperation required communication, but it allowed moving things one person could not move. Children carried lighter loads. They helped with carrying from a young age. Their strength was less, but their contribution was real. They carried what they could. As they grew, they carried more. By adulthood, they carried full loads. The progression was natural. Old people carried less. Their strength had diminished. They carried what they still could. Others helped them. The help was reciprocal. The old person had helped others when younger. Now others helped them. This was how communities functioned. This carrying moved goods through the world. It distributed resources. It brought harvest from fields. It brought water to homes. It brought goods to markets. The carrying made trade and life possible. Without it, everything would stay where it was. Nothing would move. The carrying happened. The loads were transported. Life's necessities were distributed. Tending animals. Animals provided food, labour, and materials. They needed care. The care was daily work. Animals required attention every day without exception. The work fell to specific people. Often children helped. The work was constant. Animals needed feeding. Food was brought to them. Hay, grain, kitchen scraps. The food was placed where animals could reach it. The amount depended on the number and type of animals. Feeding happened twice daily, morning and evening. The animals expected it. They became agitated when feeding was late. Water was provided. Animals needed clean water. The water was brought in containers. It was poured into troughs or bowls. The animals drank. The water became dirty. It was dumped and replaced. Fresh water was provided. This happened daily, more often in hot weather. Animals needed shelter. The shelter was maintained. Bedding was provided. Straw or hay was spread on the ground. Animals lay on it. The bedding became soiled. It needed changing. Dirty bedding was removed. Fresh bedding was spread. This happened regularly, weekly or more often. The removed bedding became fertilizer. It was piled. It composted. Later it was spread on fields. The cycle connected animal care to agriculture. The work fed into other work. Nothing was wasted. Pens and enclosures needed cleaning. Animal droppings accumulated. They needed removal. A shovel or rake was used. The droppings were scooped up. They were carried away. The enclosure was cleaned. The work was unpleasant, but necessary. Clean enclosures meant healthier animals. Animals needed grooming. Brushing removed dirt and loose hair. The brush moved over the animal's body. The animal stood still or fidgeted. The grooming continued. The animal's coat became cleaner. The grooming also allowed inspection. Injuries or parasites were discovered. Treatment could begin. Hooves or claws needed attention. Hooves grew and needed trimming. Claws needed trimming. The work required skill. Improper trimming caused injury. Experienced people did this work, or they taught others carefully. The trimming kept the animal comfortable. It prevented problems. Milking happened for dairy animals, cows, goats, sheep. The milking happened twice daily. The animal was secured. Hands grasped teats. The hands squeezed rhythmically. Milk flowed. It was caught in a container. The squeezing continued until milk stopped flowing. Both hands worked. The rhythm was steady. The milker sat beside the animal. The position was uncomfortable. Sitting on a small stool, bent over, reaching under the animal. The position was maintained for the duration. The milking took time. Each animal was milked completely. Then the next animal was milked. The collected milk was stored. It was kept cool if possible. It was used quickly. Milk spoiled rapidly. Some was drunk fresh. Some became cheese or butter. The processing required work. But that was separate work. The milking itself was simply collecting the milk. Shearing happened for wool animals. Sheep were sheared annually or semi-annually. The shearing removed the wool coat. The work required skill. Sharp shears were used. The fleece was cut close to the skin. Care prevented cutting the animal. The work was systematic. Section by section, the fleece was removed. The removed fleece was rolled and stored. It would be processed into thread and cloth. The shearing provided necessary materials. It also kept the animal comfortable. The heavy wool coat was burden in heat. Removing it was beneficial. Eggs were collected from chickens. The collection happened daily. The nests were checked. Eggs were gathered. They were placed in baskets. The eggs were brought to the house. They were stored and used. Daily collection prevented eggs from spoiling or being damaged. Watching animals required time. Someone needed to keep track of them. If animals grazed, they needed watching. They might wander. They might be taken by predators. The watcher stayed with the animals. This was often children's work. The child sat or stood nearby. They watched. Hours passed. The watching was boring but necessary. Moving animals from one place to another required effort. Herding. The herder directed the animals. They moved toward the desired location. The animals did not always cooperate. The herder persisted, calling, guiding, sometimes pushing. Eventually, the animals moved. The herding continued until they reached their destination. Sick animals needed care. Signs of sickness were noted. Treatment was attempted. Herbs might be given. Warmth might be provided. Sometimes the animal recovered. Sometimes it did not. The care was given regardless. The animal was valuable. Efforts to save it were worthwhile. Breeding was managed. Animals were kept or brought together at appropriate times. The breeding produced young. The young increased the herd or flock. They were future resources. Managing breeding ensured continued animal population. These tasks maintained the animals. The work was daily. It was year-round. Animals had no days off. Therefore, animal tenders had no days off. The work was constant, but the animals provided food, labor, and materials. The work was worthwhile. The animals were tended. They thrived. They continued to serve human needs. Conclusion: these were common jobs in ancient times. They were daily work. They were repetitive work. The same tasks happened again and again. Day after day. Year after year. Lifetime after lifetime. The work did not change much. It simply continued. The jobs described here sustained life. Without grinding grain, there was no bread. Without carrying water, there was no water for use. Without spinning and weaving, there was no cloth. Without tending fields, there was no harvest. Without making pottery, there were no containers. Without gathering wood, there was no fire. Without cleaning, living spaces became unpleasant. Without preparing food, there was nothing to eat. Without washing clothes, hygiene suffered. Without repairing things, possessions became unusable. Without carrying, goods stayed where they were. Without tending animals, animal resources were lost. Each job was essential. Each job was part of the system that made life possible. The jobs connected to each other. The spinner needed the weaver. The weaver needed the spinner. The cook needed the person who carried water. The person who carried water needed the cook. The system was interdependent. Everyone's work mattered. The work was mostly done by ordinary people. Not famous people. Not people remembered in histories. Just ordinary people doing the work that needed doing. They did it every day. They did it their entire working lives. They taught their children. The children did the work. The pattern continued. The work was hard. It was physically demanding. It was time-consuming. It filled days. It tired bodies. It created calluses and aches. But it was familiar. It was known. People knew how to do it. They had skills developed over years. The work was hard, but it was manageable because of skill and experience. The work had rhythm, the same motions repeated. The repetition created patterns. The patterns were soothing in a way. The hands knew what to do. The body knew the movements. The work did not require intense thought. The mind could wander while hands worked. This allowed reflection, planning, daydreaming. The work occupied the body, but not always the entire mind. The work was social sometimes. People worked together. They talked while working. They sang. They told stories. The work time was also social time. Relationships were maintained during work. Community bonds were strengthened. The work brought people together. The work was solitary sometimes. One person working alone. The repetitive task. The quiet. The solitude allowed thought. Some people preferred solitary work. Others found it lonely. But both types of work existed. Both were necessary. The work produced tangible results. At the end of the day, something existed that did not exist at the beginning. Flour was ground, water was brought, thread was spun, cloth was woven, fields were tended, pots were made, wood was gathered, spaces were cleaned, food was prepared, clothes were washed, things were repaired, burdens were carried, animals were tended, the results were visible, the progress was measurable. This provided satisfaction. The work accomplished something. The work was never truly finished. There was always more to do. More grain to grind, more water to carry, more thread to spin, more cloth to weave, more fields to tend, more pots to make, more wood to gather, more spaces to clean, more food to prepare, more clothes to wash, more things to repair, more burdens to carry, more animals to tend. The work was endless. Tomorrow brought the same tasks. Next week brought the same tasks. Next year brought the same tasks. This endless quality could be discouraging, or it could be comforting. The work was always there. There was always something to do. There was always purpose. The work structured days. It gave meaning to time. It provided purpose. The work needed doing. Therefore, one did it. The doing filled life. People did not think much about the work. It was simply what one did. It was life. Questioning it was unusual. One was born into a role. One learned the work of that role. One did the work. This was how things were. This was how things had always been. This was how things would continue to be. The work connected people to ancestors. The same work had been done by parents and grandparents and those before them. The same tools were used. The same motions were made. The same results were achieved. This continuity was important. It connected past and present. It suggested the future. The work would continue after the current workers were gone. Others would do it. The pattern would persist. The work connected people to the physical world, to grain and water and fibre and clay and wood and soil and animals. The materials passed through human hands. They were transformed. They became useful things. This transformation was work. The workers understood materials. They knew their properties. They knew how to work with them. This knowledge was embodied. It lived in skilled hands. These jobs were boring in the sense that they were repetitive and unchanging. They were not exciting. They did not involve drama or novelty. They were the same tasks done the same way for the same reasons, day after day. This is what boring means: repetitive, predictable, unchanging. But the work was also fundamental. It was necessary. It made everything else possible. Without these boring jobs, nothing else could happen. No art, no religion, no government, no military, no trade, no anything. The boring work was the foundation. Everything built on it. The boring work was essential. These were boring ancient jobs people did every day. They were described here simply and slowly. The descriptions were repetitive, like the work itself. The pace was steady, like the work itself. The narration was meant to reflect the nature of the work. Boring, repetitive, steady, necessary work. Work that filled lives. Work that made life possible. This concludes the narration.